few days ago with some of you whether we would put an embargo on it, which meant that it would be impossible, even if you tried, to get it into today's newspapers in the United Kingdom. Somebody wants the microphone. How do the microphones work? Sure. I'll sit down to do it. So that we've changed that. I tried to get in contact with some of you yesterday just to let you know. I'm sorry if you didn't get...
Good morning. I'm sorry you're very so early to the thing, but I'm very glad to see you all. I've got to about 1/4 past before I've got to go and just do one or two things on my speech before we get going. Perhaps I might just make a few very brief introductory remarks, and then we can spend most of the time with questions. The point I think I would most like to emphasize about this meeting is the positive approach exhibited by the United States Governor, Secretary Baker. It seems to me that the US administration is now taking a very much more positive and constructive view of the international dimensions of the world economy. And that relates both to the trade questions and the whole business of protectionism, but also to the debt problem. And I was very much encouraged to hear what Mr. Baker said yesterday. And in particular, I would like to remind you that it picks up some themes that were put forward by Michael Lawson at the London Summit last year. We have always made clear, but I think it's come out now much more strongly, that there are three essential elements of any strategy to deal with the debt problem. First of all, by the nation, without which the other elements cannot proceed. Secondly, constructive growth by the international institutions. And third, a renewal of commitment by the commercial banks in the private sector. Now, I think we have progress on each of those points this week. The level of adjustment in political terms is different in many countries, and we recognize that. But I think it has been now more generally accepted that without such adjustment, none of the rest can happen at all. So far as the international institutions are concerned, there has equally been a recognition that the World Bank can now play a broader role. The IMF was never designed to deal with persistent balance of paying problems and with debt difficulties in the medium term. The World Bank has now got a broader role to play, and again I think the endorsement of the American administration of that is one of the most positive things which has come out of the meeting. Finally, in that trio, the role of commercial banks is eventually crucial, because the problems can never be worked out on the basis of official flows only. And it is important to re-establish confidence and the sort of programs which can then be supported in turn by commercial bank lending. Now, that is the sequence in which the elements must take place. It's a sequence in which we can telescope almost into simultaneous action, but it can't be reversed. We can't expect the money to come first before the commitment to adjustment is made and before the fund and the bank flows are also opportune. We've taken a number of positive decisions on these matters during the last few days. We have set limits on the trust fund, on Engl, on capital increase for the World Bank. I was very pleased to hear of the emergency facility in Mexico. These are the details. But the broad strategy, I think, is that we're now moving into a second and medium-term phase of the debt problem. And I think that these meetings have a very positive way forward.
That's enough for me, now over to you.
Mr. Stewart, in endorsing Secretary Baker's strategy, you also endorse his views, and I believe those of the managing director of the fund, that there is room for expansion in Europe and room for policy measures to be taken to that effect.
I think that the counterpart of budget restraint in the United States inevitably means that others will need to consider expanding their own economies. I think that you say in terms of Europe, I think that by overwhelmingly the most important countries from this point of view, equally there are countries, Germany and Italy, who are in a strong enough position to consider some further domestic expansion. I should just say that the United Kingdom is now in its 5th year of expansion, along with most European countries, or indeed any of the industrial countries around the world, and we are planning for that to continue.
Alex?
Mr. Stewart, we've heard a lot from the Americans at this particular meeting about the need for developing countries to adjust their economies. However, we've heard very little from them. Mr. Baker's speech hardly referred to any adjustment by the Americans themselves. I know we've heard talk of this new debate in Congress about some limit on budget restraint, but are you still, as many British governments have been concerned in the past, concerned about the size of the American deficit, the impact of that on interest rates? Yes, we are concerned about that, and we have been concerned about it for a long time. We do, however, recognize that the administration is serious in now in beginning to tackle it. We think that will have to be a policy which will be sustained over a period of years, because it is a substantial deficit. It causes imbalances, and it can only be gradually corrected. But I think you'll have to put the question beyond that to the Americans.
Mr. Stewart, I'll take you next.
Peter on Wall Street. Will the British authorities, Treasury or Bank of England, be exercising any pressure or moral suasion on the banks to go along with the state proposal for $20 billion?
Well, obviously I can't speak for other countries, but we're going to do it that way in Britain. So we would hope that if the first two elements of the strategy can be put into place, then the commercial banks will see it in their own interest to say whatever part they judge right. And of course, if adjustment programs are in place, if the fund and the banks are able to satisfy themselves with their finance should also be committed, then I think the commercial banks may well feel that it's perfectly right and indeed in their own interest. And that they should enable this debt problem to work off gradually by providing some extra funds. But we won't be chosen to do that.
Could you identify
Now, Jones, following up Peter's question, do you sense from the people you've talked to at this meeting that the banks indeed will be increasing their lending, British banks or American banks?
I only have obviously a very early response so far. It's a sort of casual comment which one picks up as one goes around from one hotel to another. But certainly the early reaction has been favourable.
Marguerite Nugent, and then Stewart Fleming.
Mr. Stewart, keeping in line with these questions on banking, Mr. Baker said... Mr. Baker said yesterday that the U.S. would be considering altering some of the regulations on the U.S. banks. Would there be any consideration in the U.K. of altering any of the bank regulations there on how certain loans are treated?
Yes, I didn't hear what Mr. Baker said, although I have heard reports of it. I'm not sure whether you appreciate the point that although in the United States and various other countries like Switzerland, like Japan, Netherlands, and one or others, there are specific regulatory arrangements about provision against certain country debts, that we don't have a system of that kind in London. And it is up to the banks themselves how they deal with it, so it wouldn't actually apply in London.
It's just that the Bank of England has issued guidelines for the banks, and there is considerable concern, the governor's made many speeches on it, concerning capital adequacy.
Oh yes, but the bank's guidelines on capital adequacy are general guidelines. They're not specific to foreign country debt, nor particularly to individual debtor countries. And I think that was the context in which Secretary Baker was speaking.
Stuart Fleming.
Mr. Stewart, Mr. Baker appeared to make the idea of an increase in the capital of the World Bank contingent on further bank lending coming first. You seem to be putting the order in the other way around. Do you disagree with this emphasis on the bank's capital needing to follow the agreements amongst the commercial banks?
I think that's purely a question of timing. There isn't, in fact, an immediate need for a capital increase of the World Bank. It could extend its lending in the next year or two without enhancement of its capital. So in that sense, I don't think that is the correct inference to draw. What is very important is that the World Bank needs to know that there is a reasonable prospect of a general capital increase before it can plan the expansion of its lending over the next 2 or 3 years. What Mr. Baker has said now, and what other governors have said at these meetings, where we've expressed ourselves sympathetic to this capital increase, will enable the World Bank, I think, to take a more positive view of its lending program over the next 2 or 3 years, up to the time when the actual capital might be needed. But it doesn't arrive, I think, in the immediate future, whereas the commercial bank lending, if all goes well, would obviously come into play much sooner than that.
The gentleman number 7. Could you just identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Paul Lee from Korea Herald. Mr. Stewart, so I think that from what you have said, you undoubtedly heard Mr. Baker's, or by sidelines, you know what he said, and you pretty much agree with his statement. And your views on the so-called Baker plan seems to be that you're supporting his plan. So what are other nations' view on Mr. Baker's plan? Has it been widely received as the cure-all for this problem of world debts? Or are people being skeptical about whether or not it'll be feasible to implement this plan in the near future?
Well, I think that I can only give you an impression of what I've heard others say, and you may need to put your question direct to representatives of other countries. I think that it's generally received a reasonable welcome. Clearly, people will have to think through the implications of it. It's on the table now, and as I said before, many of these ideas pick up the suggestions which were put forward now over a year ago at the London Economic Summit. So they're not ideas which absolutely come out of a clear blue sky. What is important, as I said at the outset, is that they now have more positive and constructive support from the United States, and that will make it, I think, a much more practical proposition to get them implemented.
Clifford German.
Mr. Stewart, you refer in your speech to difficulties which could be involved in the Baker plan. Can you elaborate on that subject for us, please?
Well, do you want to ask me to identify?
I do need to say which is the most obvious problem.
Well, I think the difficulties relating to the debtor countries themselves are mainly related to the political effort of committing themselves to the necessary degree of adjustment. That has been one of the great problems over the last 2 or 3 years. But I would hope that with the 3-stage plan visible, provided it can be brought into operation, that would help them in some way, rather than seeing that they had to commit themselves to a process of adjustment without seeing any of the more constructive, from their point of view, parts of the package coming alongside it. So far as the fund and the bank are concerned, the difficulties, I think, are probably practical. It will be necessary, I think, for them to work more closely in cooperation, and they will have to evolve that as they go along. The difficulties of the commercial banks will be difficulties of decision-taking, because they will have to make their own assessment. And naturally, I hope that the first two elements will already be in place in such a satisfactory form that they can decide to provide their own funds as well. The other difficulties which I've mentioned in my speech are really related more to the general question of protectionism, because this whole plan will not work if we enter into a trade war. And so the two main areas of risk to the whole strategy of dealing with the debt problem and the international trading position are, on the one hand, keeping markets open, and on the other hand, dealing with the specific problems of the debtors.
I've got three on. Yes.
Do you see any particular problems in monitoring the progress in the Baker Plan and molecular?
Well, I think this will remain, in as far as the fund and the bank are involved, a responsibility of them. But clearly, if the commercial banks do decide to take a positive view of this and come in, commercial banks themselves will want to be working closely with them. I don't think that the problems of monitoring are going to be any more difficult than they are at present. In fact, if this strategy establishes a pattern which can be followed, it may indeed be easier, because it's been done in a very piecemeal fashion so far.
I've got three on my list. Peter Norman, then Dominic Harrod, and then Hamish Craig. Peter Norman, Wall Street Journal.
Are you in any way disturbed by the fact that the Baker Plan seems so designed as to make it that the US government doesn't pay a cent, and the burden of the plan is shared liberally around everybody else? Is there perhaps a slight imbalance?
I think that one mustn't forget that the Americans are the major contributors to the international bodies, and of course the Americans have a very strong interest in the whole problem because of the heavy commitment of the US banking system. So I would say that the Americans have a very direct interest in doing this, and particularly I welcomed the idea that the US administration would be look sympathetically at a general capital increase for the World Bank. Now that is a new comment which has come out of these proceedings. So I don't think that they are standing back. Equally, it does seem to me that there's something which I like to mention, because I think comment on it has been somewhat distorted. The question of the enlarged access limits has been, in some quarters, presented as an area of great dispute. What actually happened was that we maintained the enlarged access policy with very marginal changes. And in practice, if you also take into account that there are exceptional provisions for special cases, in practical terms, I doubt whether that would make any difference at all. Now, I think to some extent the US government, they may obviously put their own case, but I think one must say in their favour that the enlarged access policy has remained substantially intact, and that's a very useful commitment. It will run on, therefore, for this year while these other plans are being put into practice.
Dominic Harrod, BBC.
Following on from Peter Norman's question, which is quite clever since I didn't know what he was going to ask, I want to complete the circle with your impressions of what the American position may be during the negotiation during the next year of the 8th replenishment of IDA, and also what our position is in relation to that replenishment.
I can't guess exactly what the American position will be, but I understood them to imply that they would be willing to go along with an 8th replenishment of IDA. So far as we're concerned, yes, I mean, we've already committed an accelerated payment in the second stage of IDA 7,
we put a lot of effort in either settlement, trying to mobilize contributions and support from other countries, and we will play our part in either aid.
Do you think it ought to be larger than either?
I'm not going to venture a comment on it at this stage.
Hamish McRae, The Guardian.
Mr. Stewart, listening to Mr. Baker, it seems to me it's very much an ideological approach, an effort to try and promote free market policies within the developing countries. Now, that's fine if that's what they want to do, but it there also gives me to be asking the World Bank to behave in a much more political way. Up to now, it's been a very apolitical institution. Now it's being asked to encourage LDPs to privatise, for example. How do you react to this political change in the nature of the World Bank's operation? Could you support it, for example?
Well, I haven't seen it as quite as political as you describe it, I have to say. I think that the idea that the World Bank, although remaining for the core of its business on project-based lending, should extend the work it does on, particularly on structural lending, inevitably means that the World Bank will then take a broader interest in the way in which the economies are working. Equally, because of this long transitional phase, the gradual transfer of the problem onto a medium-term basis, I think where the World Bank is involved in those cases, it will need to see that the process of adjustment is not just a short-term one which can evaporate very quickly, but does enable the countries concerned to develop the sort of economy which is likely to be self-sustaining in due course. Otherwise, we're back at the beginning again, and one might have to set the whole process starting all over again. So I don't see it as specifically political in that sense, although inevitably, once one gets, the further one gets away from just project-based lending,